He brought what he called a message of mutual respect from Trump himself and talked about strengthening diplomatic, security, and trade ties. And the American envoy promised to work on that issue. But the question is, why are they there in a time like this?
A classified telegram demanded Burkina Faso surrender 70% of its gold within just 48 hours, or face billions in manufactured debt. Yes, you heard that right. More than half the nation's reserves gone or be crushed by economic warfare. But what followed wasn't quiet compliance. It was defiance. Live on air for the entire continent to witness. This wasn't just about gold. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and the beginning of a Pan-African movement reshaping global power. Let's expose the shocking exchange that turned a midnight ultimatum into a continental declaration. Africa will not bow. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video.
Something big happened in Burkina Faso, and I feel it's not getting the attention it ought to. And the American envoy promised to work on that issue. But the question is, why are they there in a time like this?
How does a single telegram carrying Trump's signature become the trigger for an entire nation's defiance? This wasn't just any piece of paper. It was described as one of the most dangerous documents to surface in recent African history. Its authority came not from words of negotiation or partnership, but from instructions written with bureaucratic precision. The message issued a demand that reads like an ultimatum carved into stone. Surrender 70% of Burkina Faso's gold and do it in less than 48 hours. Fail to comply, and the consequence was economic strangulation through debt that experts argue had been manufactured in the first place. The ultimatum was framed as a debt recovery strategy framework, a phrase that made the entire operation appear benign, even reasonable. But beneath that polished wording lay the mechanics of something far darker. The plan outlined that control of Burkina Faso's gold production would be handed over to U.S. mining corporations and IMF-appointed managers. Export routes would no longer be sovereign.
President Donald Trump deployed U.S. envoy led by official Will Stevens to Burkina Faso to go strengthen. The Minister of Foreign Affairs in Burkina Faso criticized the U.S. official for blocking access to essential military equipment.
They would be funneled through intermediaries approved abroad, stripping local authorities of any decision-making power. An American advisory board would have the final say over what contracts could be signed and how revenues would be distributed. In effect, this was not financial recovery. It was a detailed guide for economic occupation. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not just about minerals buried in the ground. It was about their right to determine the future of their nation without external oversight. The telegram read like a balance sheet, but its invisible lines were written across daily life. The handover of gold was not only the loss of wealth, it was the erasure of sovereignty. And to heighten the insult in exchange for their obedience, the message dangled a thin promise of protection from regime change.
Strategic ties and partnership with Burkina Faso. Well, so they said. He said, and I quote, "Africa is a continent like no other, and Africans are human beings like no other."
Protection in this context looked less like safety and more like a reminder that non-compliance could invite instability, chaos, or worse. The cold mechanics of this ultimatum carried echoes from the past. Across Africa's history, such demands had often arrived wrapped in treaties or demands presented by colonial administrators. This was the 21st century version of that same strategy, now dressed up as international banking policy. What critics began to call economic colonialism 4.0 was less about open conquest and more about financial paperwork operating like shackles. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Africa was carved up at conferences and by gunboats. Today, the slicing occurs through contracts overseen by institutions that claim neutrality but serve particular interests. For ordinary Burkina citizens, the dramatic questions remained unanswered during those tense 48 hours. Could a small, landlocked nation resist the unified pressure of great powers and international institutions? Was this ultimatum simply too overwhelming to challenge? Markets hesitated, communities whispered, and state officials waited as millions wondered whether their independence had already been signed away. The air was thick with uncertainty, every hour ticking down to what might become the submission of their resources resources, or a reckless gamble against overwhelming odds. Then came the response. On national television, Ibrahim Traoré appeared before his people and the world. Instead of retreat or cautious negotiation, his words cut through with unmistakable clarity. He told his citizens and all of Africa, to the people of Burkina Faso, and to our brothers and sisters across Africa, they are not just demanding debt payments from us. They are not simply demanding 70% of our gold. What they truly seek is the fear within us. He followed without pause.
But the question is that the reason why they are there? He brought what he called a message of mutual respect from Trump himself and talked about strengthening diplomatic, security, and trade ties.
We will never surrender our land to repay debts you have imposed. We will never bow to your weapons or your banks. The gamble had been answered. Fear was replaced with an open refusal. But this rejection was not the end of the story. It would soon become clear that those words were the start of something far greater, a spark that transformed into national resurgence and lit the first fires of continental resistance. What happens when one leader's refusal transforms into a shared continental fight? Traoré's televised rejection of the ultimatum was not just a national stance. It was received across borders as a direct challenge to the economic order imposed on Africa. His words were broadcast into living rooms far beyond Ouagadougou, touching students, farmers, and soldiers in neighboring states. In those few minutes of live television, resistance was no longer only the burden of one small nation. It became a symbol large enough to inspire communities across the continent. The Western expectation was simple: isolate Burkina Faso, apply pressure, and force compliance. But what actually unfolded was the opposite. Within days, Mali, Niger, and Guinea made it clear that silence was not an option. They declared solidarity with Burkina Faso and began constructing what observers compared to a regional security shield. This alliance, known as the AES, was not announced with fanfare but with concrete steps. Mali stationed senior military strategists near Burkina Faso's most valuable gold sites. Niger organized essential logistics teams trained in survival across harsh desert supply routes. Guinea provided its airspace, ensuring equipment, food, or medicine could flow freely if a blockade was attempted. The message was unmistakable. Foreign interference would carry a price. This union gave rise to a striking paradox. While Western powers believed coercion would fracture Africa further, Traoré's defiance was pulling neighbors into cooperation. Suddenly, small states that had long seemed peripheral were presenting themselves as a collective security bloc.
Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré in Ouagadougou to discuss renewing cooperation between the two nations. Minister Traoré made it clear that they weren't looking for anyhow partnership, that they want a partnership that will respect their sovereignty.
There was no grand dazzling summit, no grandstanding declarations to the world stage, only practical steps that built trust hour by hour, soldier by soldier, plane by plane. Amid these moves at the state level, there was an equally important wave rising at the grassroots. In universities from Dakar to Kinshasa, students declared their campuses part of the struggle. Slogans like "Our resources, our future, our fight" appeared on murals and banners, turning public walls into canvases of defiance. Neighborhood associations organized cultural events where songs and theater performances carried the message further. Digital spaces became even more critical. Young Africans refused to allow global media giants to control the narrative. CNN and Fox News reports that painted Traoré as reckless or dictatorial were cut, remixed, and uploaded back online as protest songs and parody clips. One of the most viral moments was when teenagers printed t-shirts reading, "If CNN hates you, you must be doing something right." Then came decisive action inside Burkina Faso itself. With momentum building, the government nationalized every gold reserve. Western companies were no longer granted ownership or mining rights. Their contracts revoked without negotiation. Gold funding was placed under permanent state control. This step was far more radical than mere rhetoric. It marked the moment when sovereignty became legal and binding, inscribed into policy. The manufactured debt strategy had not only been resisted, it had failed outright. And worse for its architects, the failure generated something far more dangerous: African unity, strengthened ties with global non-Western partners, and the sense that the world's economic stage was tilting. If one of Africa's smallest and poorest nations could catalyze this shift, reshaping alliances and exposing the weakness of old financial tools, the question must be asked: what happens when the rest of the continent chooses to follow? This was never just a story about gold. It was about a nation refusing to be reduced to numbers on a balance sheet, and a people demanding demanding dignity in the face of global pressure. Traoré's stance revealed something far larger than a debt dispute. It marked the beginning of self-determination, where Africa is no longer treated as a passive supplier of resources. Burkina Faso's rejection signals a wider awakening, one with the potential to redraw the world's economic map. And the question remains, if one nation can resist with such force, what could happen if the entire continent spoke with one voice?